Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. The ASEAN-ROK Logistics Think and Biz Forum, the policy session, is now ready for its second session with the theme Transportation and Logistics, where we will address the ASEAN-ROK cooperation model in response to the realignment of the global value chain in the changing environment. I will introduce the presenters, and after all three presentations have been delivered, we will invite the moderator, presenters, and the panelists onto the stage for in-depth discussion in the panel session. Korean and English simultaneous interpretation is provided. Channel 1 is for Korean and Channel 2 is English. For smooth proceedings of today's event, I'd like to ask the presenters to finish your presentation in 15 to 17 minutes. Following the morning session, I'm sure we have a most fruitful time ready for you this afternoon. I ask you to join us until the very end so that you can gain great insights. The first presenter this afternoon is Mr. Shin Yoon-sung, Research Fellow at the International Industry Division of KIET. Please welcome Mr. Shin with a big round of applause. And the topic of the presentation is the rise of ASEAN with reorganization of the global value chain.
Good afternoon. I'm from KIET. I am a researcher, Shin Yoon-sung. So people are saying that we're doing much better in terms of responding to COVID-19. So the system has shifted to with COVID-19 era, but we're still wearing our masks. And things really haven't changed that much. And economies around the world have been very much affected by COVID-19. However, the ASEAN economies are actually doing much better because of the opportunities that were presented by the crisis. And there are also many expectations and forecasts pointing in that direction. So I will use this time to talk about the rise of ASEAN with reorganization of global value chain. The presentation will be broken down into three sections. First, it's the impact of COVID-19 on the global economy. And second, the reorganization of GVCs amid COVID-19. And third, a new chapter for ASEAN-Korea economic cooperation. How ASEAN is now emerging as a new production basis in the world. The first chapter of the presentation will deal with the impact of COVID-19 on the global economy. As you may be very well aware, COVID-19 was like a perfect storm. It has actually shaken the whole world upside and down. And for the past 80 years, the world has never seen such a recession, but due to huge stimulus by various countries. There was only 3.5% contraction in the global GDP. However, its impact, the scarring effect, still continue to this day. And the World Bank, they have published their economic outlook, indicating that in 2021, there was a strong rebound due to the vaccination efforts. And in terms of the advanced major economies, vaccination rate has reached 75% to 80% of their population. Yet the developing economies, their vaccination rate is reported at 6%. But depending on the countries that have high vaccination rate and those that don't, we see much divides. In much of the minus markets, of course, there was a much dip in the stock markets. However, there was a reckless spending, fiscal spending by governments. So much stimulus money put in the market, especially in the commodities market, the real market. There was a much drop significantly, but due to the stimulus package by the government that went up, that actually raised the price pressure, the inflationary pressure. So prices are actually going up. We're now moving into the inflationary phase. Yet, in terms of the economic activity around the world, due to social distancing as well as restrictions, lockdown, and also travel restrictions, we are still in that negative phase, the economic growth rate. And also in terms of the Asian economy, so tourism really accounts for a great portion of the economy, like Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia. And all the ASEAN economies really are heavily dependent on tourism in terms of their global GDP. But due to travel restrictions, they're very much hit by the COVID-19 crisis. And also in the case of global trade, there was a much contraction. But fortunately, starting this year, there is a rebound. But in terms of the supply volume, we still see that there's a lot of issues. Especially in terms of the semiconductor industry, there is a huge demand, and supply is unable to match that demand. So that's leading to disruptions in the supply chain, and also the logistics side. That's also experiencing a lot of bottlenecks. So in the United States, for example, they have issues in terms of loading and unloading of the products. And in Korea, some of the key strategic products, we see disruptions in the supply chains, which is resulting in a slowdown in the economic activities. Case in point is the urea water. And also last year, some of the automotive components, even the cheapest component, the inputs were not delivered to the OEMs in Korea on times, which led to production disruptions. Now, regardless of these issues, ASEAN for the past 10 years have been increasing their importance in the global value chain, and that importance is only going to grow stronger going forward. And I've done some analysis on the GVC. According to the ADB statistics, Korea and Japan have been producing intermediate goods, and they export that to China. And they finish their finished products to Korea and Japan, and then the final products would go to the United States. And in 2008, China began to emerge as an intermediate production basis. Now, after 2008, Korea and Japan are now supplying intermediate goods not only to China but also to the ASEAN market, and China are supplying some of their intermediate goods to ASEAN market. And through the ASEAN market, China is exporting their goods to the final end users in the US. So that's actually creating another global value chain, which is leading to an increasing importance of the ASEAN market in the global economy. So in the GVC, why is ASEAN rising as a new driving engine, growth engine? So first reason is that the growth rate of China, well, is explained in the graphs over here. It's really unique there. The export really isn't a big driver in the GDP of China because they were really not value-added products, first of all, so really didn't contribute that much to the global, the economic growth rate of China. And analysis shows that rather than the manufacturing sector, construction or service sector created actually more added values than the manufacturing sector in the case of China. And if you look at the labor unit cost, now China really is showing a sharp increase, $10,000 per capita in terms of the labor unit cost, which is leading to increased income, which means that the price competitiveness of China is not as high as before. So we see these structural issues in the Chinese economy. Now, we are seeing the relocation of the production bases from China to ASEAN economies. And the most determining factor is that there's a trade conflict between the United States and China. Now, China really needs to reduce its reliance on the United States. Of course, it's a commitment, it's a promise. It can be broken, but global companies are now, for example, they were going into China, they were using their infrastructure, labor, but they're now trying to withdraw their presence. They feel burdened, and they have to know which sides to take. So, except for the in China businesses, they're trying to relocate their businesses to the ASEAN market from China. So FDI, especially, is flowing rapidly into the ASEAN market, especially in terms of the volume as well as the speed. So when it comes to the GVC, basically the MNCs would want to go to the cheapest place where the extensive amount of value added can be created. Now, if the MNCs are now pulling out of the Chinese market and onto the ASEAN market. ASEAN really is faced with this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. For example, whether you're a democratic country, depending on your democratic structure or your lockdown policies, some of the countries are really enjoying a lot of FDIs flowing into their region. So again, ASEAN is emerging as a new growth engine. So what should Korea do? What's an implication for Korea? So let's now take a look at the NSP. So that's leading to a lot of trading volume growth for Korea that is going to continue into the future. But it's concerning to say that in terms of the trade balance or the trade volume, now ASEAN, we see a lot of trade balances or imbalances growing with ASEAN because ASEAN is becoming a big trading partner for Korea. And really interesting to note that there's a lot of investment. According to the Exim Bank of Korea, about 40% growth was witnessed in terms of investment into ASEAN. Even with the COVID-19 situation in 2020, the growth rate hasn't come down, which is really unique factor to point out. So automotive, steel, iron, and the secondary batteries. In terms of the FDI for Korea, the largest volume is actually planned in relation to the ASEAN market. So the investment into the ASEAN region will continue and the size will only grow larger. And for the finished car, in terms of the components and parts, well, there are a lot of parts to go into the car. So that's going to increase intermediate goods export. And unless they're substituted by imports, it will lead to increased export from Korea for the time being. And the U.S.-Sino trade conflict, and due to COVID-19, we see a reversion to the trade protectionism. This is becoming a very strong trend. And there are lockdowns, containment policies, as well as reshoring. But due to CPTPP and RCEP, ASEAN is actually seeing more growth in terms of free trade. But why is ASEAN still gravitating towards free trade? It is because that they have this renewed confidence in manufacturing that's reflected in these numbers. So according to Kiat this year, or actually the team that I belong to, we've done some analysis that there are a lot of economic effects to be generated from the investment. We've done the value chain analysis on that from 2000 to 2010. On an annual basis, $89 billion of value added was created, and 3.6 million jobs are being created per year. And especially if you break it down into the production step and the investment step, the red line shows the effect created from the production phase, which is much bigger than the investment phase. But of course, there's a lot of activity in the investment in terms of the automotive and petrochemical, secondary batteries, and there's a lot of capital expenditure being spent, 1 trillion to 10 trillion. Once that's converted to the production phase, it will lead to greater value added that will lead to greater number of jobs provided for the local employees. So we think that once you go into the production phase, added value to be coming from the production phase will be 20 times larger than the added value to be created from the investment phase. So going forward, the economic cooperation between Korea and ASEAN, depending on the relocation of the production basis, the economic cooperation will only become stronger. And if there's a lot of conflict still between the United States and China, especially because we see technological hegemony, the war between the two countries. The countries are now trying to vie for a new type of value chains, which is going to mean greater opportunities for ASEAN on the other hand. So again, in terms of fair trade, ASEAN is now emerging as a new player, and economic cooperation with Korea that's becoming very important. There are a lot of benefits to be drawn, especially Korea has a much manufacturing competitiveness. A lot of value added to be created from here, even compared to service. We had the third largest competitive edge, and IoT #1, and also we have developed or commercialized hydrogen car for the first time. So our prowess in manufacturing sector could play as a very favorable factor in the ASEAN market, especially as we shift to the with Corona regime, with trading resumed. So not only in terms of investment in the manufacturing sector, most of the ASEAN economies, because they're mostly developing economies, they're in the 6,000 to 10,000 per capita income. So they're the middle income countries. So if, for example, they go into that middle income trap, they say they're unable to, for example, upskill or develop their capacity higher. We have strong manpower in Korea. We have strong education base, technology, infrastructure, social service, human capital, and know-how, knowledge to be shared. And that is really going to serve as a big boost for ASEAN to be able to move out of the middle income trap. Thank you, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for that useful presentation. That was Dr. Shin with the presentation. So talked about the impact from COVID-19 on the global value chain and the reorganization of the value chain, how that is leading to ASEAN becoming a new production base, and what Korea should do in terms of promoting its economic cooperation with ASEAN. So thank you very much for that wonderful presentation.
And we will move right on to the second presentation. The presenter. This presentation will be online. We have for the second presentation. While we are waiting for the connection, let me give you a housekeeping announcement. This policy session, we are now in the second session with the topic transportation and logistics. Yes, and in the meantime, we have now full access to the second presenter. From the Korea Maritime Institute, KMI, we have Mr. Hwang Sun-il, Research Fellow from the International Logistics Investment and Analysis Center on revitalizing the market entry of logistics SMEs and mid-tier companies through ROK ASEAN cooperation. Here is Mr. Hwang. Can you hear me? Can you hear my voice? Yes, we can hear you clearly. Could you share your screen? I've shared my screen. Can you see it? Yes, we can. Good day. I will be speaking about the revitalization of market entry of logistics SMEs and mid-tier companies through ROK and ASEAN cooperation. I am Hwang Sun-il from International Logistics Investment and Analysis Center of the KMI. This is the content of my presentation. We will be going over topics such as global changes in the logistics environment, current status of major shipping ports in ASEAN region, policies to support, and ways to further revitalize them. So we have top 7 megatrends taking place in the global logistics environment. The first one, majorly led by leading economies, we do see accelerated population aging and a high level of concentration of administration and economy in urban areas. And secondly, emerging markets are growing and leading the growth of global trade. And there is heated competition to secure supply of resources globally. And of course, climate change, such as COP26 and European nations, these organizations are leading the way in the importance of logistics in eco-friendly manner. Carbon tax is also being adopted. And with the advancement of technology, digital-based economy is being innovated. Now it is becoming more and more important to have the right knowledge and talents. And of course, sustainable growth has now become essential. And we are seeing emphasis on international cooperation and social responsibility. And ESG, which is a hot topic nowadays, has arisen from this background. And from this perspective, these are the top 4 issues of global international logistics, starting with digital logistics, AI, IoT, drones, blockchains, and cloud technology. Secondly, B2C logistics, business to customer. And third, green logistics, as mentioned earlier. And finally, risk management and resilience. These are the 4 major trends that are taking place in the international logistics stage. And in particular, as we heard from the previous presenter, the US-China trade conflict and COVID-19 have really boosted the realignment of global value chains. In the past, for lower cost and the go market entry, offshoring was in general, but now the plants have moved to a nearer shore locations, or they have reshored back to the country. And active discussions are taking place in the same direction. And since the second half of 2000s, a huge increase in demand for containers have taken place, and that has led to higher supply and port congestion that has hurt the punctuality rate of ships, leading to a bottleneck in the global value chain of containers. And because of the bottlenecks, ships cannot ship in time. In particular, as of November 2021, container freight index increased 170% over the year, which was a remarkable increase. And next, the current status of shipping and ports in major ASEAN nations. The ASEAN is the second largest trade partner of Korea. With continued economic growth, we have a middle income population on a steady rise and is transforming into a consumption market and an FDI market. The GDP growth rate of ASEAN is also remarkable. Compared to the global average of 2.97%, ASEAN's growth rate is 1.7-fold. As of 2018, China accounted for the lion's share of Korea's trade with 23.6%, followed right by ASEAN with 14%. Out of the top 20 trade partners of Korea, 6 ASEAN members are in the list. 6 out of 10 ASEAN members, again, are among the top 20 trade partners of Korea. If you look at the size of ASEAN-controlled fleet, there are 7,788 vessels, or 14.6% globally. In DWT terms, that's 191 million tons. As of 2019, ASEAN's container shipping volume reached 120 billion TEUs, or 14.9% globally. And for ports, in terms of cargo throughput, we have Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, which are the leaders that have 9 out of the top 50 ports around the world. And if we look at some details, China, Japan have very short time at port. Myanmar has the longest time spent at port by ships. And if you look at trade customs efficiency, Hong Kong and Korea have ranked high, but Myanmar, Brunei rank relatively low. So in general, on average, in terms of time at port and customs efficiency, ASEAN is slightly behind Korea, China, Japan. Next is policies to support the market entry of SMEs and mid-tier logistics companies. The Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries find and support promising projects to help shippers and logistics providers to enter into overseas markets under the project to support the market entry. And this was launched in 2011. There is the feasibility study support, and since 2014, shipper and logistics company joint entry support has also started. As for feasibility study, A shipper or a logistics company, if they wish to establish a local company or acquire a local company or invest in the local facilities, for all these different types of investments, feasibility study for these projects are supported by the government. And for joint entry, when shippers and logistics company providers cooperate to enter into a local market, then the government can provide financial support as well as consulting services. Since 2011, 112 business cases have been supported by the Market Entry Support Project, 64 for feasibility study support, and 48 joint entries have been supported under the project. By size, if you look at the share of supported companies by the company size, SME and mid-tier companies accounted for 80%, large companies 20%. And recently, all of the supported companies were SMEs and mid-tier companies ever since 2019. So more focus has been on supporting these SMEs and mid-tier companies. So under the same project, if we look at the destination countries, 46 of the destination countries were ASEAN countries with 41%. Of that, Vietnam topped the list with 24 cases, followed by 5 Malaysian cases and 3 Cambodian cases. Examples include entry into the Malaysian frozen food market, local food supply chain, RMLA company in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, operation of Malaysian port claying on dock ports. Despite all the support, there are limitations of Korean logistics companies that are active in ASEAN, because most of the companies that enter into the ASEAN market from Korea are in manufacturing and trade. And only 2% are logistics with 331 cases. So providing high-quality logistics services is not actually being done at the moment because most of the logistics companies are in transport and storage services. So in order to have a competitive edge in the market, SME and mid-tier companies need to have facilitated support by discovering the promising projects and under the right support policies. This is the final part of my presentation, some measures to revitalize market entry of these companies. Last recently, because of COVID-19 and the U.S.-China trade conflict, the supply chain has really been disrupted. The low-cost efficiency was the focus in the past, but now risk management and resiliency have become more important in terms of strategy. So in short, short sourcing, and diversifying the sources, and also managing the risk and having the quick resilience from a disruption are becoming more important. Recently, the trade conflict with Japan was there, and also high reliance of trade on China are challenges. So we need to diversify our production infrastructure currently focused on China and Japan into ASEAN nations such as Vietnam, Taiwan, Thailand, and Indonesia. And to this end, we want to diversify our production infrastructure by reinforcing our supply chain and to support more active market entry by Korean logistics companies. So there are 3 different steps in the support. First is pre-business support to determine whether businesses are willing to enter into these markets. So they have to conduct a feasibility study there. And the second step would be business development support, establishing companies, making investment. And this is the actual business stage. And finally, post-business support for stable business and survival and growth. So currently, most of the government project is focused on the pre-stage of business for market entry and providing information and supporting feasibility studies. But in the actual business development stage, to support SMEs and mid-tier companies, there is not enough government support. So during the business development stage, for example, interest subsidy can be provided or equity interest can be taken up by Port Authority or Korea Ocean Business Corporation in a systematic manner. These are, I think, the support policies that needs to be further developed. And also, we can also think of finding a variety of business models. Not only shipper and shipper logistics company joint entry, but investment in the terminals or hinterland by the Port Authority or KOBC, interest taking up equity interest, or platform companies that support shippers and logistics companies. These are some of the ideas that we can pursue to diversify the business models. And also for ships, procurement centers, smart logistics centers or distribution centers for large investment that are needed for these projects, we need to provide public funding for stable financing, and the public sector needs to share the risk. For example, Rotterdam distribution center, the one in Barcelona, and by Busan Port Authority, and Vietnam Comprehensive Distribution Center are good examples. And as a way to reinforce support policies, we can provide matching services to batch shippers and logistics companies. For example, there are logistics companies with strong local presence that are already in the local market that can be found to be matched with the sub-shipper. We can have comprehensive and large-scale information and data for a shipper that's willing to enter into overseas markets to easily find the right partner. The National Logistics Information Portal, or KMI's weekly international logistics newsletter, or other trends, news that covers global logistics trends should be provided more actively. And in the longer term, we also need to build talents and provide solutions to enter into overseas markets in a more advanced, under a more advanced program. And last but not least, we need to develop ASEAN experts. Those are specialized in ASEAN logistics. Since 2005, we have provided support for shipping and port logistics expert training program to foster a pool of ASEAN experts. So this has led to tangible results, but experts' employment overseas has relatively been slim. So we need to provide measures to expand the employment of logistics specialists in ASEAN regions, and we need to change the perception of the standard of living or quality of life in these countries and provide customized policies. So that was my presentation on ways to revitalize overseas expansion of logistics SMEs and mid-tier companies. Thank you very much for your listening. Yes, thank you, Dr. Huang, for your presentation. The changes in the international logistics stage was covered, and you also presented ways to support the market entry of logistics SMEs and mid-tier companies, and also how to revitalize the expansion. Many presenters are saying that we need to reduce the reliance on China and diversify our sources of trade. And in that sense, they are stressing the importance of ASEAN. So through the forum, I hope we can see further facilitated cooperation. We would now like to have the third presenter also joining us online. From UNSCAP, we have Representative Mr. Kim Soo-yup. The topic is Regional Cooperation for Sustainable Transport Development in Asia and the Pacific.
So, are you connected to the line, sir? Can you start sharing the screen, please? Can you see the screen? Yes, we can see you very well, sir. Can you start your presentation? Thank you for the introduction. UNSCAP is based in Bangkok, Thailand. I work for the Transport, Connectivity and Logistics section at the Transport Division. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the organizer, KMI. I will talk about the maritime value chains, especially the important subject of sustainable transport. It's indeed an honor for me to present today, and as was presented by the previous speaker, at a forum like this or workshops, we need to work together to strengthen our capacity to ensure sustainable transport and logistics. So my presentation will be broken down into 4 sections. First, I will give you an overview status and trends on sustainable transport. And second, challenges and issues facing the major stakeholders. And third part, major opportunities for sustainable transport. And fourth part, way forward for policy development as well as policy recommendations for ensuring sustainable transport. The slide shows the SDGs and its relations with transport. In 2015, United Nations General Assembly was held to adopt the Agenda for Sustainable Development for 2030. Many governments as well as public sectors came together to adopt the 17 major SDGs. And they're working together to achieve the SDGs. The sectors are interrelated with one another. They have high reliance and dependence. We need to take a simultaneous approach to approaching this. And especially transport is related to road safety, energy efficiency, sustainable infrastructure, as well as urban access and fossil fuels. So transport has indirect as well as direct impact on various SDGs. And 10 days ago or so, we had a COP26 at the end of November. No, at the beginning of November. And so we are going to be working to reduce our carbon emissions as well as coal. And by the middle of next year, countries will be required to submit their enhanced NDCs again. So in terms of the NDCs and the COP26, the government as well as the private sectors have different approaches to that. So we really need to come up with strong follow-up measures. There are various countries at risk, especially the small island nations, due to climate change, and their voices were not completely heard at COP26, held at the end of October. So the IMO, as well as the International Organization, have been working towards achieving SDGs as well as sustainable maritime transport. And as well as for the last 5 years, UNASCAP has been working alongside its member countries. We'll also come up with the 5-year plan next year for development. And the detailed plans will be shared with you at a later part of my presentation. So Asian as well as the Pacific Island nations, at the individual nation level, for the sustainable transport, have various programs in place. So rather than implementing them on an individual basis, they have to be actually merged to create synergistic effects. So that is why cooperation will be critical in this regard. In the AP region, so I mentioned before, the Asian Development Bank, ASCAP, as well as APAC, and BIMSTEC, various international organizations have launched initiatives for greenhouse gas emissions reductions, as well as sustainable transport, especially in the maritime sector or marine sector. IMO published IMO 2020, the Surfer Cap. So that's requiring the whole maritime industry to work towards that goal, which is related to the reduction of NOx, nitrogen oxides emissions. There are heavier regulations to that. So the shippers are, for example, installing scrubbers, and they're substituting their fuels by LNGs, or they're also going low sulfides in terms of their fuel used for the vessels. So in terms of their the shipping, the companies' goals and targets, of course, it may vary. So in terms of the maritime transport, decarbonization strategies will need to be fully considered and will have to be implemented thoroughly. Dr. Huang from KMI gave us an overview on the Asian Pacific container and maritime market. So I think the next couple of slides will be helpful in that regard to deepen your understanding about this. So it shows the container throughput. We expect to see continued growth in the throughput. World Bank as well as the IMF statistics and their data show that by 2025 and 2030, there will be 5.8% to 4.6% respectively. Relating to this outlook, there's a caution to be exercised. For the empty containers, there's an issue of repositioning of empty containers. If you look at previous statistics, the share of empty containers would be higher than 20%. Recently, the share has gone up to 23 to 24% of total containers. The reason being, there are imbalances in the import and export volumes containers, and also the limited volume of containers. And the repositioning of empty containers are faced with various hardships and difficulties due to disruptions in logistics, especially around the Americas region, loading and unloading, reason as well as coming back to the port due to the cargo, the shippers. There are a lot of disruptions which are only going to continue in the near future. We really need to pull our efforts towards overcoming this crisis. This is the share of container of ASCAP. In the ASCAP region, we have a very high share, which is 68% in 2019. By 2025, the share will increase to 70%. According to the estimate, if you break it down into sub-regions, China, Japan, and Korea, the East Asian region will account a lion's share, about 74%. The other Asian region, 15%. And they're about 2 to 3%, very minor shares in the AP region. Global container volume in the ASCAP region are shown here together with the container throughput. According to 2019, global container port volume reached 811 million TEU. And ASCAP has our own estimate model for the container throughput calculation. Our estimate shows 761 million TEU. This is a bit shorter or smaller than UNCTAD. Other figures, it is because of the fact because our estimates are pretty much based on import and export containers, and other estimates include domestic containers as well. Hence, divergence in numbers. We also expect the growth to be at 5.8% by 2025 and slow down afterwards until 2030. And by 2030, the throughput will surpass 1 billion TEU. And by then, we expect the growth to be realized. And ASCAP's share of port container throughput will increase to about 72 to 75% of global throughput. not only the ASCAP region, but if you look at the global throughput market, you can see that the TEU has been growing greatly in terms of the vessel size. However, the number of companies, due to the M&As, there has been a lot of consolidation in the market, so we see fewer companies. The number of the shipping companies has actually decreased over the years. On the other hand, the deployed capacity has been growing. Because the shipping companies were rerouting their transport lines to increase their efficiency in delivery. I will now talk about challenges facing the transport sector in the ASCAP region. There may be some overlaps with the previous presentation. Again, ASCAP, in terms of the development, population, territorial expense, they're very different by country. Depending on where you are located, how far you are from the ocean, there are archipelagos, or there are small developing island nations, SIDS, and there are also inland countries like Laos PDR. So ASEAN is a group of diverse countries. Therefore, ASEAN countries, especially in the ASCAP region, confront complex set of issues. The slide here shows that most of the problems will not be present in those advanced economies due to, for example, lack of infrastructure and so forth. Most of the ASEAN countries have road transportation infrastructure. That would be the major mode of transportation. They're very divergent, decentralized. There's also a very wide digital gap within the country. They don't have an integrated intermodal system, which is undermining the potential for growth within the country. In the ASCAP or Asian region, transport and logistics costs are relatively high, yet performance is not as high. World Bank's DI or UNCTAD's index, LSCI, show that we're on the extreme ends of the spectrum. Like China and Malaysia, they have high index performance, but the Pacific Island nations, their points are in the 10% range, very low. There is also less developed integrated intermodal transport system. That means there's a lot of cost burden to be borne by shipping companies, and there's a lot of a lack of security in the system. And there's a lack of efficient transportation system, very complicated. And there's a lot of inland transport traffic amongst and between ASEAN countries. But in terms of cross-border transit and mobility, there's much room for improvement. So ASEAN Highway, Trans-ASEAN Railway are being pursued through an agreement, but there's a lack of data Also, a lack of physical infrastructure, hence leading to a low level of effectiveness in transportation. And there are also a lot of road traffic accidents compared to other regions. For example, if you go to other Southeast Asian countries on a business trip or on leisure, a lot of motorcycle accidents, cars come out of nowhere. There are a lot of risk factors in the road. You really have to watch out where you go. So it's very important to prevent traffic accidents and also to ensure fast and prompt response when that accident occurs. So again, it's a very cost-bearing structure with low performance. The right diagram shows how the global supply chain is actually flowing with much bottlenecks in the middle because of the port congestion, the trucking companies, the labor input is decreasing due to COVID-19. That's leading to much backlog, cost going up, putting much pressure on value chain.
다음은 해운 분야에 좀 집중해서 저희들이 안고 있는 이슈들을 좀 찾아보고.
Next, let me focus on shipping issues. The ESCOP countries lack in infrastructure, lack in investment, and also in terms of priority in policy. Many problems to be addressed. That's very much focused on coastal areas, and these problems have been around for such a long time. Now, international traffic is open, very advanced, but policies for these individual countries, the inland nations, it's very much left to their own device. So they're really not operating to the global standards. That is why the government really needs to step in and provide a lot of incentives and investment. And as you may be very well aware, the GMS, the Greater Mekong sub-region, I think this was mentioned by our Vietnamese speaker in the morning, Thailand, Myanmar, Vietnam, Thailand, and Laos, CLMVT, the acronym. This sub-region countries in the Mekong Basin, they're inland countries, but there are geopolitical issues. So there's not much progress being made in transportation. So the ASEAN countries can actually use the inland routes plus their air, sea, and that is where we should focus our efforts going forward. Next, port issues or port development related challenges. There is intense competition amongst ports in the region. All countries have a lot of issues, yet are aspiring to become regional hubs with a lot of investment, capex being spent on infrastructure. Now, the existing players, of course, are trying to strengthen their position with additional investment. So there's a lot of finance needed, but where is that money going to come from? And also the road network, land, transport, they're actually developed separately in silos, not in an integrated manner, which would have to be ultimately linked to ports. So they're developed in different time periods. They're not fully integrated. And there are also lack of investment issue.
항만 부분에서의 이슈는 주로 정부나 항만공사,
So
지자체 같은
port facilities, the government, public
있고
institutes,
있다고 볼 수 있겠습니다.
institutions really have to be fully involved in the port's development because it's usually the public initiative.
태풍이나
In ASEAN, there are natural disasters like storms, sea level rise, or tsunami that occur quite frequently.
국가처럼 이 소유 사태도 일어나고
Some countries, for example, have political rife, the civil unrest
외국 투자가들이
leading to
그리고
dampen investment outlook.
융통성, 다양성이 이 해당 지역의 매력을 높이는 중요한 요소들이 되고 있다고 볼 수
And that could have an impact on the dynamic nature of ASEAN economies.
저희가 이슈에 대해서 여러 것들을 말씀을 드렸는데 그거를 정리해서
So I've talked so far about the challenges in the areas of economy, society, environment, and governance. I will just skip this details over here.
다음 슬라이드 가기 전에 한 가지 강조를
Before I move on to the next slide, I just want to emphasize that in terms of the port, harbor, and the transport, port throughput, profitability, and these traditional indicators are emphasized very much in the ASCAP region. However, recently, environmental indicators, which are becoming very important these days, but they have not been the traditional major drivers for transport development. So when we usually go and meet these transport authorities, these government officials are all about quantitative growth, how to build up and build out, not really about sustaining them, how they're making a contribution from the port side to the overall well-being of society.
그래서 이런 것을 바탕으로 이 슬라이드 설명을 드리면
So that's the context to this presentation slide.
차원에서는 이 economic development, social
Economic development, social inclusion, environmental protection are the three pillars that we want to focus on for balanced development.
보고 있고요. 자세히 보시면 좀 세부적으로 이 섹터들이 조금 다릅니다만은
There are specific sectors involved in all three pillars,
다른 정책에 또는 다른 섹터에 영향을
but you would be able to understand that each element would have a linkage to the other element in another pillar.
말씀을 드리면 이제
So coming to my conclusion, so sustainable transport
필수적인 사항이 됐고요.
is not an option, but it's a must, it's a requirement.
얼마나 스마트
Our policy, therefore, has to be smarter, eco-friendly, and safe and secure.
이거를 이제 다른 표현을 하면 이제 디지털라이제이션
So it's all about digitalization
드리는 부탁드리겠습니다.
and decarbonization.
이제 저희들이 이제 에스카뿐만 아니라 모든 나라 기구가
Not only ASCAP, but international organizations are committed to sustainable development,
뿐만 아니고
not only in terms of responding to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions reductions,
물질의 글로벌 서플라이 체인
but because of the global trend, and also to build a better and sustainable, resilient supply chain, because that's very much related to our social and economic well-being.
측면에서는 IMO나 UNFCC
IMO or UNFCCC
규제나
are driving the effort to enforce regulations.
뭐 단순하게 그러한 규제에 대응하기 위해서라기보다는
So not just in terms of legal compliance, we want to be enterprising, we want to be creative in ensuring sustainable transport.
상태냐는 저희들의 의견인데 끌려가기보다는
Rather than being reactive, we want to be proactive
그런
in trying to harness this crisis and as an opportunity.
이제 앞서 말씀드린 것처럼 이제
As I mentioned before, digitalization and decarbonization are the major trends to which we want to pursue our efforts.
그림이 좀 흥미로우실 수 있는데요.
This chart will be an interesting slide for you.
한국에서는 것처럼 매 5년마다 이제 5년 단위에
Just like the Korean government does, we come up with 5-year rolling plan in the transport sector. We call it Regional Action Plan.
지난 5년 단위로 이제
So for the past 5 years, we have had various programs and projects implemented. So from 2021 to 2026, for the next 5 years, UNESCO transport sector wants to implement the following policy, programs, and projects. On the left side, you see a list of thematic areas like regional land transport connectivity, maritime, digitalization, low carbon, urban transport, road, inclusive transport. So 7 themes here.
앞서 테마에서 다른 것들이 대부분 이렇게 조화가 되는 부분이라고 판단이 됩니다. 사실 이 6개 주제는
They're very harmonious.
글로벌 또는 개별 국가 차원에서도 대부분
Not only at the UNESCO level, but each individual country would have some type of initiatives to that effect.
특히 이제 저희 해운 항만 분야에서는 두 번째 주제인 마리타임 커넥티비티,
Maritime connectivity, the second theme, and digitalization, and also smart port and low carbon,
선박과 항만에서의
which is related to vessels and ports, CO2 mitigation,
되고 마지막으로는 이제 그 통합교통, 항만
and integrated transport.
없죠.
Because ports can only go so far
연결되느냐고
in terms of climate change response.
같이
It has to be linked back to the overall transport system. So for the next 5 years, these thematic areas will be reflected in our projects and initiatives,
프로그램들을 운영할 계획입니다.
various programs.
이게 이제 다음 달 12월
And next month, in the 3rd week of December, from the 13th till the 17th of the month,
전체 교통물류
there will be a UNESCO Transport Ministerial meeting that will conduct a review of these themes.
이것들이 승인되면
And once they are approved,
힘을 받고 진행할 수 있을 것 같습니다.
we can gain greater impetus.
지금 잠깐만요. 하나만 더 말씀을 드리면 이제
One more thing before I close.
이제 사실 뭐 정책이나 또는 폴리시 레코멘데이션
Whether it is a policy or policy recommendation,
진행시키는 것이 보통의 방법이긴 합니다만
of course, normally we would try to match that one-on-one to a challenge that was identified. But I know I cannot use more time, so I will just try to summarize my points for recommendation.
나중에 좀 더 여러분도 같이 살펴볼 기회가 있을 것으로 보고요.
I'm sure you would be able to read them at your convenience. So it's all about decarbonization policies and digitalization policies.
개발될 예정입니다. 이런 것들을 위해서 이제 스캅은 이제 4가지 일하는 방식이
So UNESCO
이후에 다양한 방식이 있습니다. 첫 번째가 이제
has the following 4 strategies. We have analytical work
각적이 안고 있는 문제에 대해서
that we conduct.
프로세스가 있고요.
It's a process for conducting an analysis on the issues, and we have capacity building programs where we're inviting our people from private and public sector to upskill
그다음에 이제 이 글로벌 스탠다드
these manpower. And we try to promote harmonization with global and regional standards. We call this process norm setting. Lastly, partnership and cooperation. There are so many countries and so many stakeholders at play here. So without without cooperation, we really cannot produce any tangible results. And especially sustainable transport requires cross-border cooperation between and amongst countries and stakeholders.
다시 한번 요 회의를 준비해 주신
Thank you, and I want to thank the organizer once again, KMI, and I will conclude my presentation.
네, 강연 주신 UNESCAP.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kim Soo-yup from UNESCO, for your presentation.
에스캅 지역에
In the port and shipping area, you've shared with us challenges and issues to be overcome and to be addressed, especially in terms of ESG point of view. You have gave us a multifaceted view that really helped us in terms of understanding. And also, development of maritime transport is not an option, but it is a must.
시스템 발달을 위해서
And for that type of a system development, what policies are needed, what would be the UNESCOP's strategy going forward. So thank you very much for your wonderful presentation.
저희는 교통
And now, under the theme of transportation and logistics, we have heard 3 presentations.
발표를 통해서 저희가 못다한 이야기
And we would like to continue on our discussions in the panel session.
진행해 주실 좌장
I would like to invite the moderator of this panel session.
태양 수산개발
From KMI, we have Mr. Lee Sung-woo, Head of General Policy Research Division. Please welcome Mr. Lee with a big round of applause.
네, 좌장님을 무대로 모셨고요.
Yes, we have Mr. Lee. And now, as the panelist, we have from Inha University, Professor Kwon Oh-kyung. Please come forward and also welcome Mr. Kwon with a big round of applause.
네, 그리고 앞서
And we would also like to invite back Mr. Shin Yun-sung, the first presenter. Again, please welcome Mr. Shin with a big hand.
네, 그리고 온라인을 통해서
And we have 2 presenters joining us online who will also join us for the panel discussion. We have Dr. Hwang Sun-il and Mr. Kim Soo-yup.
그럼 저는 마이크
And now, the moderator, Mr. Lee, you have the floor.
네, 안녕하세요.
Good afternoon. I am the head of General Policy Research Division of the KMI. My name is Lee Sung-woo. We at the ASEAN-ROK Logistics Think and Biz Forum. It is an honor to moderate the transportation and logistics session. The 3 presenters have raised very significant points. Starting with Mr. Shin Yun-sung, Dr. Shin Yun-sung, you raised the importance of ASEAN and also the global value chain disruption, which has actually highlighted the importance of ASEAN. And ASEAN also has self-confidently may replace China or as a manufacturing base and actually gain from the tensions between U.S. and China. And in that front, you stress the importance of cooperation between ROK and ASEAN. And next, research fellow Hwang has mentioned the logistics companies in Korea, how they are entering into the ASEAN market, but because the logistics environment is lagging behind, we need to provide more support, and more logistics companies are entering into the ASEAN region, but we need greater support for SMEs and mid-tier companies to provide better logistics environment there and build capacity in terms of logistics among the Korean companies. And you also pointed out to the policies that should be rolled out. And next, Mr. Kim Soo-yup from UNESCO. You mentioned the global agenda of sustainable transportation.
You gave us an overview of the overall sustainable transport, emphasized the need for collaboration as well as 2Ds, decarbonization as well as digitalization in link to the transport. Talked about a smarter way of doing business as well as a safer way of doing business. So we really don't have a lot of time left for the discussion. And
존경하는 인하대학교 권오경 교수님.
Mr. Kwon Oh-kyung, professor from Inha University. He's the only discussant over here, so I'll be able to ask him to just share his views with the three presentations.
박사님.
And Dr. Shin and also our two online participants will be able to make their additional comments afterwards.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you. I am Kwon Oh-kyung from Inha University.
반가운 얼굴이 보여서
It's good to see Mr. Kum Soo-yeop. Sawadee-kap. It's great to see you again.
사와디카만 하면 안 되니까
And I should also say Shin Chao. Slama, sorry. Wow, great. All great. Thank you.
굉장히 의미 있는 세션에
Well, first of all, this is a very important session, and I'm very grateful to be invited as a panelist for this session. And since all the presentations have been summarized, well, all three presentations were all very important and very informative.
제가 여기에 뭐 평가를 한다거나
I have no personal
하는 것보다가
comment to evaluate the presentations or raise any specific questions. But as recommended by Dr. Lee, I would just like to add a few comments to the points raised by our presenters. This very event, Global Korea Convention,
한 아세안 물류
is really addressing the Think and Biz Forum for ASEAN and the ROK. So think, meaning we need to think of some of the points for further development of policy. The supply chain issues of late is affecting our daily lives, and also the U.S. head of state has actually convened a meeting on this very topic. So this is a very important agenda, but it's very sad to see that this agenda is not fully being discussed. So although this is a small session, I think we are discussing a topic that can have a potentially large impact. The global supply chain at the moment closely links the nations with industries. And in a way, it is very complicated, almost to the level of an internet world. So think of a global supply chain as an internet. The internet developed a global universal standard, and likewise, a global supply chain will be able to, through mega FTAs, become standardized and in a seamless manner.
근데 이렇게 연결되다 보니까
And that is the way to go for logistics. But this also links to butterfly effect, and as we are all becoming very sensitive
언론에서 뭐 서플라이
to the impact and global supply chain squeeze
네트워크의 병목 현상
or bottlenecks in the supply chain in the logistics.
글로벌 가치 사슬은
Global supply chain
확장된 것은
started to expand globally in earnest 20 years ago since China was acceded to the WTO. The global companies relocated to Southeast Asia and China for lower cost. And that really gave a boost to the expansion of global supply chain. Of course, advanced nation companies moved there for lower cost, and emerging markets also wanted to learn technology and build capacity. So for a while, this went on, but since the global financial crisis, the GVC expansion remained stagnant. There are for many reasons, but developing nations learned what they could from participating in the GVC, and also they have a global supply sources were well established. But recent U.S.-China trade conflict was another factor. Going forward, the structure of the global value chain could undergo a massive change. In fact, since the global financial crisis, as GVC remained stagnant, and there was not much of an employment despite the economic growth. This was called the new normal. The trade growth rate and the GDP growth rate were similar. And plus, we now have the COVID-19 situation. Recently, scholars in the industrial sector have been calling this a new abnormal state. No one can understand this current situation.
우리가 글로벌 공급망 재편에 대한
So
제안을 하기 위해서는
to present the policy recommendations for the realignment of GBC, we first must understand why this realignment is needed. So number one, as I mentioned before, global supply chain. Since the financial crisis, there has been a stagnant, so
번째는 이제 코로나
the recession in the global supply chain. And secondly, COVID-19 has become a factor. So I shouldn't be using too much time, but COVID-19 is equivalent to a natural disaster. But if you look at the tsunamis and other natural disasters and earthquakes, there's a big difference.
어떤 영향을 미치던 것보다 전 세계
Its impact is global, not local. And global financial crisis hit countries sequentially, but COVID-19 broke out all over the world at the same time. And while financial crisis impacted demand, supply and demand are impacted by COVID-19. So this is an unprecedented disruption. But gratefully, we have vaccines developed, and China is recovering quickly, more quickly than expected. And as mentioned, there is so much liquidity available, plus an asset bubble that is all facilitating consumption, even to the point of bottlenecks in logistics, supply chain, and lack of supply. And since we have KMI and great talents at KMI, I believe that from the global logistics industry level, all this will be resolved. And on top of that, there's the trade tension between U.S. and China. In particular, this trade tension between U.S. and China, we need to also note that the United States sees supply chain as in terms of economy and national defense and security. So you mentioned blue line and red line earlier. The United States was a group of allies
중국이 좀 딴지를 걸어도 공급에 문제
to withstand strongly and to provide unwavering support, even whatever China does. And they want more allies to join in this group. We have a trading partner with China, but we also trade with the U.S. So we need to tread this water very carefully between U.S. and China. And of course, carbon neutrality is very important. Digital economy also
공급망 재편 영향을 주니까
are impacting the realignment of global supply chain. So when there is a restructuring of global supply chain to define the roles of ASEAN and Korea, we need to fully give consideration and in depth the 4 to 5 factors I have just outlined with enough data.
신 박사님
And in that sense, Dr. Shin's analysis was very significant.
제가 보는 관점에서
And from my point of view,
한국과 아세안의
for the cooperation between ASEAN and ROK to move forward, I think 2 main themes will be important. Number one,
차이나 플러스 원 전략이라고
China plus one strategy is emerging. U.S. or European companies, rather than single sourcing from China, which has led to many issues,
한 나라 정도 더 해서
are now moving away to diversify their sources to add another main source of supply. And moving towards parallel sourcing as opposed to single sourcing to prepare for risks. So in one hand, they want to build a block of supply chains. So we call this Factory America, Factory Europe, or Factory Asia, the 3 big blocks. We are in sight. And the United States, for United States, what's important is which will be the plus one, the parallels of the added source. If it's going to be Latin America, there will be little impact to Asia. But if they want that block additional source to be in ASEAN, that will be a huge impact on Asia. For Korea, if we were to add one more source, it's likely to be ASEAN. So China plus one strategy and forming blocks of manufacturing sources will be very important perspectives we need to keep in mind as we proceed with our cooperation with ASEAN. So in that sense, Dr. Shin's numbers are very important, and the characteristics is the Factory America and Factory Europe,
블록을 형성하긴 하지만은
they form a block each, but
지역과 예계 지역이 계속해서 증가하고 있다.
they have growing
기업도 증가하겠지만 영내 기업이 많이 증가하고 있습니다.
out-of-region companies with ASEAN. But on the other hand, Factory Asia, they have regional companies that are growing as well.
아세안이 들어가는 이런 그런
We have ASEAN in the middle
관점에서 이제
of the trade with US or Europe. So with this perspective in mind, yes, I agree that we need to develop better strategies. And what are the tasks at hand?
저희들이 이제 꼭 생각해야 될 게
We must not forget that this type of global supply chain is not like an communications network. It takes a very long time to build.
우리가 이제 중국이 로컬 소싱이 자유로워지고
Well, as we were liberated from local sourcing, and for China to be free from local sourcing, and up until they joined the WTO, it took 25 years for China to make this path. So even if we shift to a China plus one strategy, this will take a very long time.
겟투게더도 하고
So we need to get together. We need to come closer to one another.
두 번째는
So this will be needed, and we must not forget. And secondly, Dr. Huang, in your presentation, you showed a slide where ASEAN countries are working hard, but they still lack infrastructure. Because China made so much investment in physical infrastructure and logistics infrastructure.
역할을 하는 국가가 되기 위해서는
And to become a complementary region against China, there is massive investment that needs to be made in logistics. And to go beyond diversity, we need a development of standards, which is one of the roles of the UNSCAP. If this is not done well,
중국의 역할이 오히려
then the role of China could actually get bigger
역할이 지금과는 다른
and different from
그러면 GBC에서
the current backside participant, but now in the GBC, China will move to the fore and take a frontline participation, front-side participation. So there are both challenges and opportunities can come from this shift. So we need to take more interest in logistics. So to reach my conclusion, Korean companies and the government must have a longer-term perspective as we engage in cooperation. So we call this a new Southern policy. We have a counterpart, so it takes more than just our commitment. We need to continue to communicate with our partners, to develop new business cooperation models, and in particular, the next business session's topic also is in the same line. We have a strong digital power, so we can build a common digital platform so that ASEAN nations would find it attractive.
이렇게 보여지고요.
And these are ideas that we need to present to our ASEAN partners.
또 하나 이제 제조업
And one more thing, manufacturing.
진출할 때
When manufacturing companies enter into other nations, logistics companies should go hand in hand. That's what happens with Japan, but not so much in Korea. So they need to accompany a logistics provider as a partner as they enter into other markets. So maybe government can provide an incentive to this end. And since I belong to a university, just one more thing.
대학에 최근에 그 유학
Inha University has been receiving more and more international students, and currently the majority come from China. We want to attract more students from Southeast Asia. Maybe we can offer scholarships so that we can together foster a pool of talents in this region. And Mr. Huang, you mentioned at the end developing a pool of talents in logistics specialists in ASEAN. It's great to train Korean students to that end, but we can attract ASEAN students to Korea to train them into a specialist. I think that could be a better and more effective short-term answer. And for the government or state-sponsored research institutes or NRC, I would like to ask you that research was divided into nation, industry, region, but now we face a completely different type of economic situation in the global supply chain. So going forward, we have representatives from NRC. I think we need to diagnose the global supply chain by each sectors and build the right strategy and undergo a paradigm shift as to how we approach the global supply chain. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We were supposed to finish by 3:20, but the organizer gave us 5 additional minutes, but we need to really wrap up in 2 minutes. So to the presenters, I'm going to give you 10 seconds as if you're trying to make a meme or a TikTok. Well, you can actually abstain from your voting right, up to you. So I will give you 20 seconds, okay? And then you have to give me the microphone back so I can wrap it up. Feel as if I'm one of the idols in the group, standing at the center of the stage. From the Kiet, we had the Urea water issues, and people were saying, for example, why we weren't able to diversify our source because we had a reliance in China up till 90%. We had to report it up to the highest level of the government. But even in the HS code, 10-digit, and these were very smallest elements that really were not fully captured in the data. So as a researcher, we really didn't use a theory to make the predictions, but you would really have to deep down look at the micro level data as if really have to work at a manual level. I think this really needs to be refined by our approach going forward. So thank you very much. That was actually more than 20 seconds, but thank you anyway.
We have international guests joining us online, and we would love to hear everyone's comment, but in the interest of time, we must wrap up the session. And of course, we are unable to take questions from the floor. We would like to separately answer the questions uploaded online. The key word for the transportation and logistics session, I think, is cooperation. How to connect cooperation to together address these various challenges would present the answer to how we can live together in the future. And with that, I would like to conclude this transportation and logistics session. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the moderator, presenters, and panelists for this session. We wish we had more time, but I'd like to thank all the speakers for sticking to the point and raising poignant insights. Thank you. This is the end of session 2. And after a short break, we will return at 3:30 for the third session. We will see you back here at 3:30. Thank you.